Well, thanks for having me, and greetings from Waihi Beach, Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's a gorgeous afternoon here. I live at a small surf beach on the east coast of the North Island, but I've also had the pleasure of attending visiting your lovely state. I attended the 2012, I think it was, TCAL conference. Took the opportunity to travel around Tasmania. It's very like New Zealand, so I felt very much at home. Lovely place. So now I've said all the nice things. Today we're going to talk, today we're going to talk about just some of my research, and as Andrea's introduced to you, my particular interest and expertise is in reading, and particularly in the word level component of reading. And so before we get into that, I'll just, with the initial statement, fully acknowledge that there's complex and long-standing debates about literacy. We could talk all day about literacy, and we could all be coming at it from different points of view. I saw an interesting paper this week where it's Stephen Reeder from Portland University, very good man in literacy and in reading, and he was talking about literacy proficiency and then the subcomponent of reading as reading components, which is how I see it too. So we're talking today about reading components, and that's not to say that all those other important debates about literacy aren't there. I premise that reading underpins any literacy development, and my interest, long-term interest as a teacher and then as a literacy practitioner in the adult sector was less skilled adult readers, and I was particularly focused on those who have attended school in Australia or New Zealand. They speak English as their main language, and they have failed to acquire skilled reading as children or in the school system, and so it's very likely they've got entrenched reading difficulties, and I was very interested in what those were. And I set out to, as a practitioner, realise that there was so much we didn't know. So I set out to try and build my knowledge about reading skill and what was happening with us adult reading teachers. I'm one of you, and I was trying to get a clear understanding of the processes whereby adults learn to read. So whatever journey you're on, I heard some of you say you're quite new to this process, but we acknowledge that reading's an involved cognitive skill. No one theory of reading is going to cover it all. There is agreement in the sector amongst all us sometimes debating academics and practitioners that skilled reading involves competent coordination of many components. I call them subcomponents. So we're talking about decoding, word recognition, vocabulary, fluency, reading comprehension. They must all come together for a reader to be a skilled reader. And individuals can have difficulties with one or more components, and it leads to a breakdown in the reading process. There's no one way to teach this, but to be effective, we must be informed about reading, and we have to be flexible in the approach we take, and we must focus on the individual learner needs. And you might be thinking, yeah, well, we all know that, and it's one of my little bugbears, because we've been saying it for 20 years. We're going to be learner focused. We're going to focus on the learner needs. One size doesn't fit all, but then we just try and make programs of reading or reading instruction do just that, and it's not going to work. I believe my research would back me up here, that word level skills are crucial to skilled reading, and there's ample evidence mostly from America and England is where I've drawn a lot of my background research from before I did my own studies, that support that inability to quickly decode a word, and we call it automaticity, will lead to a breakdown of the reading skill. So I was interested to find out a little bit more about what was happening in somebody's head. What were they doing when they were having difficulties with that word decoding or breaking down the word? I think there's consensus that we need a balanced view of how we teach reading, and that we can't just use one view or one approach to teaching reading, but we also, there's evidence to suggest that this isn't actually reflected in the adult reading programs across the world, where even though we're giving lip service to it, we're not necessarily doing this in practice. So I looked at what's happening when we're reading, because with skilled reading, it all happens so quickly, it's difficult to see what cognitive processes are happening, what's happening when we read a word. And we know that for us it's happening automatically, but for many of our less skilled readers, some of them will be relying on memory, some of them will be able to partially decode some words, some of them will use context. That means they'll read the sentence and try and work out the word from what's there, and that's often argued to be a good way to teach people to read. And it depends what the focus of your program is. If you're just there for a few weeks to bring them up to skill really quickly on a health and safety issue for a workplace, we may use strategies such as context, but we know that less skilled readers over rely on context. So if we're there to develop reading skills overall, we would not be using context as a main strategy. We're teaching them to decode and to the phonological processing that involves there. We also know that the way all of us read a word depends on that word. Because English has so many irregular words, many of those irregular words we just know, and those of us who are more skilled readers have banks of thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of irregular words that we can just retrieve from in here. But we know that less skilled adult readers have real difficulty integrating all the processing skills required to retrieve words or to decode words. So if you've worked with adult readers or done some research on it, you'll watch lots of things happening. You'll watch them relying on perhaps working out the initial syllable and having a guess at the word. They will remember certain patterns of words and try and work out the word from that, rhyming it with a word they know. There'll be lots of different things they fall back on. And I was interested to find out more about that in terms of Australian and New Zealand readers, because there wasn't a lot of research. There isn't still a lot of research in that area. So I interviewed 36 adult readers in WA. I was up the top of Australia there, and I also came back to New Zealand. I used my networks to find learners who identified as less skilled readers and were prepared to be interviewed. So what we did was the interviews ranged from 1 to 2 hours. I had learned from experience doing my masters that you try and get it all over in one go, because they may not be around for the next interview if you stagger it over a couple of sessions. So it was, got them in the room, off we went, and we did a series of tests to find out what their word reading was like. And I used all the recognised adult appropriate diagnostics, non-word reading, and assessments that are used, diagnostic assessments that are used in other research. And then I talked to them about what was going through their heads as they were reading certain words. So while the test was happening, I was making notes. I also taped all the whole interview and transcribed them later, and then spent a lot of time thinking about it and analysing what was going on, because I was trying to grasp what they were doing as they read words and how they did it. From that, I got lots of information, but I wrote a paper using a narrative type approach, whereby I told a story about what the readers were doing, and I used the analogy of readers trying to find their way through a journey through a wooded area. And I came up with 4 categories of word readers, which I think represented the 36 I had interviewed, and also my own experience as a practitioner, plus the research and literature I'd read from other research that's been done overseas. And I came up with the categories, and the first reader I called the locked out reader. And those readers are largely unable to make any sense of the words, the sounds, and they feel locked out, don't know how to start. And some of them, I'd ask them questions like, when a teacher tells you to sound out a word, what do you do? And some different responses. But one young lady said to me, she said, I don't know what they're talking about, but I don't want to hurt their feelings. So I just nod and tell them I am sounding it out. And I said, do you know what sound out means? No, she had no idea what sound out means. So it was all these things that I had been using, these terms and expressions I'd been using. I became more aware that I needed to be unpacking a whole lot more about what was happening for my readers. The second category was the anxious reader. The anxious reader is unable to make a start, really. They're hesitant and unsure. They're able to make a start, but they're anxious and hesitant and don't really know. They're not confident about proceeding. They largely rely on a bank of sight words they have, but they avoid situations where they're going to encounter unknown words, and they easily get lost in the reading. Many of them will have memorized particular texts that they need, or they will take things home and get someone to assist them. So that was the anxious reader. The third category of reader was the what I called the wandering reader. And the wandering reader, it can be quite confident for parts of the journey, and sometimes they're unaware they've made a wrong turn. They will have used incorrect information about a word, and from that, the rest of the text doesn't make sense. When I was encountering this category, I remember myself as a Latin learner. That ages me, doesn't it? Way back, and when I had I thought the word was a bear. I can't remember the exact thing, and so I had to translate it from Latin into English, and the whole thing didn't make sense because I'd misinterpreted the noun, the Latin noun, and so I wrote this whole story about a bear in a cave, and it was nothing to do with a bear in a cave. And we'll see this with our own readers. They'll grasp a word, think that they've got it right, and then proceed to try and make sense of what they're reading. I called them the wandering readers. And then we saw a category of determined readers who plod on. They're not going to give up no matter what. They're going to persevere. They have mastered many skills and strategies, and they're going to get there in the end, but it's a slow, exhausting process. And I expect some of you have had the experience of, growing adults. My time, some of them were old men that were older than me, but now I'm more encountering men and students that are younger than me, and crying, but not wanting to give up. I remember saying to one guy, let's just leave it till next week. I'm not going to stop, he said. I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to keep going. The determined readers. So there were these categories of readers that bore out what I'd seen, my own observations as a practitioner, my own readings of the stuff. And I just thought those 4 little categories were useful for thinking about what might be happening. The implications were that it did confirm that these subgroups of readers exist. We're trying to use the same approach, but there's all these subgroups. They require distinctly different approaches and program content. It has to be targeted to where they're at, and we can only work out exactly where they are at by the diagnostic assessment and the ongoing formative assessment to be all the time. And I think if those of you who are practitioners, you think you've got something sorted, you've prepared the lesson, you're going along, you think, I'm on the wrong track here. And one of my approaches with readers, learners and classes, I'll just say, I think we need to leave this. I need to go away and think about how we're going to approach this next time, because I've realized that I haven't read the situation correctly as to where they're at. And I think that it's one of my catch cries, we've got to do this diagnostic assessment, I believe, to get to know what we're doing. Otherwise, we're wasting their time and ours, and often reinforcing their sense that it's something they can't do, because we don't mean to be doing it, but we're just keep using an approach that hasn't worked for them in the past, and we are just reinforcing their lack of belief in themselves with the best intentions of the world. And again, I think you can reflect on this. You would have seen the anguish in some of our learners when they can't grasp what we're trying to tell them. So from there, the other thing that sort of came into my mind during this long, lovely process of doing all this research was, why do we as practitioners practice the way we do? What's driving this? And there's it's a large body of research, not just with educators, but how beliefs inform our actions. And there's that even if we can be given all sorts of evidence to the contrary, some of us will, if we believe, yeah, I know that's the case, but I still think it might be like this. And we see this in lots of situations, and we can have all sorts of evidence put in front of us, but we're not going to grasp it because we really do think that that plant my mother gave me when I was little, that's what cured my cold, not the drug that the doctor's giving me, or you know. So there's all these issues, and there's nothing different about us as educators. The way something is taught and why it's taught that way is often informed by our beliefs and not by the research. Now, practitioner experience is still a very valid thing, and we don't deny that. And I mean, I've been a practitioner for a long time, and I draw widely on my experience, but I also need to sometimes put that in check and think about what the research is telling me about these things. Multiple studies have demonstrated the crucial role beliefs and values of teachers play in determining what's happening in the program. And there's also studies that will show that a lot of this is intertwined with our own experiences as a learner, that we learned that way. So I just know if I can just get that across to them, they're going to learn that way. Whereas in fact, if they were going to learn that way, it probably would have happened when they were at school. But you know, so these are the sort of things we've got to keep telling ourselves, and understanding why we teach in a certain way is fundamental to understanding the impact of our teaching. So I decided, and I'm backed up by lots of people, they probably pinch their ideas, that we need awareness of our own philosophy about reading and how we learn to read, as well as what we're doing as we teach. So I did two major pieces of work on this one. First one was I surveyed about 60 adult literacy practitioners in Australia and New Zealand. I did it through just a monkey, what do you call them, monkey survey, when you set it up, and I got some people that were pretty good at doing surveys to have a look at it, to make sure I wasn't doing too many leading questions and things like that, the sort of things you do to cross-check that your research is sound. I was exploring, in that case, the instructional approaches that we as teachers used, and to do it, I created this fictional learner called John and gave a whole lot of his test results from diagnostic assessments, plus some of the things that would have commonly be said at that initial interview. I think John wanted to learn to read more about sports because that was his interest. There were a few things about John that me as a normal tutor would get when I first was introduced to John to inform my teaching. And then I asked open-ended questions about how each of these teachers would teach John, and got an interesting range of approaches that would be used. There was, what you'd expect, a good range of adult appropriate approaches, people that were using authentic, high interest materials and content. There was a lot of collaborative approaches discussed, skills instructions. People talked about that they would focus more on the meaning of things. There was the full range of all the reading approaches that are currently raging probably in discussions in adult literacy in New Zealand and Australia. And there was quite a lot of evidence that people completely disregarded all the evidence I'd given them about John, that because one of the clear things that was in the diagnostic assessments was the guy couldn't decode at all, and that he and people were saying that they'd do this and this, whereas John actually had said what he wanted. He wanted to learn how to read the newspaper better. And so many of us, we were just going to do what we would normally do with a reader, regardless of all the information that was presented about John. And from that, I came up with some categories of our approaches and this is the initial presentation I did at TCAL was called striving to be a responsive practitioner, because I decided that the ideal for all of us is if we could be responsive as practitioners to what the evidence was showing us about John and what John needed. So we got a lot of approach was centered around being a reassurer, and that made sense. We do what we do because we care, but there seemed to be a feeling that if we just make this reader comfortable, if we give him a cup of tea, if we make him feel welcome, not threatened, he's going to learn to read. Yep. Well, those things are important, but they're not going to teach him to read. Then there's the instructor, this person that was going to do this and this and this and this, and sometimes there wasn't, again, the formative assessment going on about what John really needed. With the theorists coming in, lots of people who knew a lot about reading, but the responsive practitioner was bringing all those approaches together, all those approaches. They were informed by the theory, they were doing a lot of instruction, they were very reassuring, very caring. And so that was an interesting thing to see, the different range of approaches. And I followed that up in the survey. I asked if any of them would be prepared to be interviewed one-to-one, and 19, well, I think more volunteered, but I interviewed 19 teachers. And from there, I was not just talking about their approaches. So then I did semi-structured interviews with 19 of these teachers, trying to find out a little bit more about the origins of their beliefs, and how they thought someone would be, why that person was a less skilled reader, and what needed to be done to get them to become more of a skilled reader. And I mean, in research, there's always my own bias comes in, but you structure it in a certain way that you're hopefully getting a wide range of, you get huge amounts of data, and then you have to analyze it and think about it. So from that, I was asking questions like, what did you hope to achieve in the session? Why was that important to you to achieve that? What do you think would be a good outcome from the session? And then I listened to the tapes over and over again, as you do, because I taped them and transcribed them. And I came up with a set of perspectives about why we think somebody is less skilled, and then the sources of those perspectives. So, and again, won't be necessarily new to you, because these are all perspectives and beliefs that we probably share or have experienced. But what's useful here is to get us to reflect on these things, because these are the things that underlie the way we approach the teaching. And we need to be aware that these things are there, and then be aware that we need to be informed by what the science is telling us. So we had groups of, and I started adult literacy teaching a long time ago, and I could see myself in a lot of this. And what started me on my journey to do all this study was that I could just see that I had the best intentions in the world. I was enthusiastic. I wasn't, and I'd started even this with school kids when I was a primary school teacher, and I wasn't able, there were people who couldn't read, and I didn't know what to do, and I just got sort of frustrated, and I wanted to know more about it. And you know, these things aren't not true, but they stand on their own. They're not enough. So there was a perspective that the distinct needs of that reader hadn't been met when they were young, and if their needs had been met, they may have learnt to read. Now, that's not untrue, because we know from about the 25% of the population who will present at school with reading difficulties, if they get targeted explicit help, probably about 10% of them are going to overcome those issues as children and move on. So it's not untrue, but the distinct needs hadn't been met. They've all got this life baggage they carry with them. That's why they haven't learnt to read. These are the views. People feel that they've had an inappropriate learning environment, and that's what stopped them learning to read. And then some people said, well, they hadn't had the complete reading skills and they hadn't had the right instruction at the right time. The phonological awareness developed and the orthographical processing developed. And then there was also an interesting one that came through a lot, that many of us as practitioners felt that they just hadn't developed that joy of reading. I love gardening, whereas some people, my husband calls it outdoor housework. And I keep thinking, if everybody just develops a joy of gardening, they'll all want to garden. Well, it's the same. Not everyone's going to want to read, but everyone has to be able to read to a level. But this undeveloped sense of joy, that some people get almost charisma, you know, oh, I just love reading. I just want to give that joy of reading to the reader. Now, I might sound like I'm making fun of it. I'm not. They are all important things, but they on their own are not going to help that person read. It's part of it. And so it was just interesting to reflect this myself, see some of them were definitely my perspectives, my beliefs, and just to give, I think that for us to be effective practitioners, to understand this more, we need to understand this more. We need to be aware of the approaches we're taking and why, and we need to be aware of our underpinning philosophies about the way we're approaching the teaching. And the findings across the world would suggest that our fixed views of reading, ours, the whole lot of us, link back to our own literacy education, and notions of what to teach are only partially referenced by what we now know about how people learn to read. But it's not all bad news, because we're all still doing lots of very good stuff. So to make decisions about what to read, how to teach it, need to be very conscious about what's happening there. And that's, I'll stop there. I mean, I think you've probably picked that you get me talking about reading, and you'd have to probably kill the Zoom at midnight. So in Kiwi land, we say ngā mihi, which means thank you.